Hi, welcome to Healing Tunes. Please watch the video. Hi, today we are discussing the white matter of cerebrum and lateral ventricles. White matter of the cerebrum is a compact mass of a vast number of nerve fibers and associated neuralgia. It lies deep to the cerebral cortex and forms the large volume of each cerebral hemisphere. The fibers of white matter connect the various parts of cerebral cortex with each other and to the other parts of central nervous system. The classified into following three types on basis of type of connection they provide: association fibers, then commercial fibers and projection fibers. See, the green line is the commercial fibers, then C-shaped blue line is the association fibers, and uh, projection fibers is the orange rose line. The association fibers interconnect the different regions of the cerebral cortex in the same hemisphere. There are of two types: short association fibers, arcuate or U fibers, which interconnect the adjacent gyri by hooking around the sulcus. Hence, they are also called arcuate fibers. Second is the long association fibers, travel for long distances and interconnect the widely separated gyri, that is gyri of different lobes. The long association fibers are grouped into bundles. For example, bundles of long association fibers are uncinate fasciculus, cingulum, etc. Cingulum, then superior longitudinal bundle, inferior longitudinal bundle, fronto-occipital bundle, etc. Next is the commissural fibers. The commissural fibers interconnect the corresponding area of the two cerebral hemisphere. The bundles of such fibers are termed commissures. The important commissure of the brain are as follows: corpus callosum, anterior commissure, posterior commissure, hippocampal commissure, and habenular commissure. See, the number one is the corpus callosum. Then second is the anterior commissure. Then third, posterior commissure. Then fourth is the hippocampal commissure. Then fifth is the habenular commissure. Then corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is the largest commissure of the brain, connecting the cerebral cortex of the two cerebral hemisphere. Since it connects the neocortex of the two sides, it attains enormous size in man. It is 10 cm long, nearly half of antero-posterior length of hemispheres and consist about 150 to 200 million fibers. Next is the anterior commissure. The anterior commissure is a small round bundle of white fibers which crosses the midline in the upper part of the lamina terminalis, immediately in front of the anterior column of fornix and interverticular foramen. The anterior commissure consists of two components, a large posterior neocortical component and smaller anterior paleocortical component. Next is the posterior commissure. The posterior commissure is a slender bundle of white fibers which crosses the midline through the inferior lamina of stalk of pineal gland. Next is the hippocampal commissure. Hippocampal commissure interconnect the crura of fornix and thus the hippocampal formation of the two sides. Habenula commissure. The habenula commissure is a slender bundle of white fibers which crosses the midline through the superior lamina of stalk of pineal gland. Next is the projection fibers. The projection fibers connect the cerebral cortex to the subcortical centers such as corpus striatum, thalamus, brainstem, and spinal cord. These fibers are of two types, corticofugal fibers and corticopetal fibers. This is the projection fibers in the capsules. Next, corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is the largest commissure of the brain connecting the cerebral cortex of the two cerebral hemispheres. Since it connects the neocortex of the two sides, it attains enormous size in man. It is 10 cm long, nearly half of antero-posterior length of the hemisphere and consists of about 150 to 200 million fibers. External and relation of corpus callosum is corpus callosum forms a massive arched interhemispheric bridge in the floor of the median longitudinal cerebral fissure connecting the medial surface of two cerebral hemispheres. It forms roofing over both the lateral ventricle. It lies near the anterior end of the hemisphere than posterior end. The sagittal section of cerebrum, it is seen a C-shaped mass of white fibers on the medial surface of hemisphere forming the roof of lateral ventricle. Then parts of the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is divided before backward into the four parts. First one is rostrum, then genu, trunk or body, splenium. First one is the genu. It is thick covered anterior extremity of corpus callosum which lie 4 cm behind the frontal pole. Genu forms the anterior boundary of anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. The fibers of genu sweep forward on either side into the anterior part of frontal lobes, forming a fork-like structure, the forceps mirror. Next is the rostrum. The genu extends towards and backwards as the thin prolongation to join the lamina terminalis forming rostrum of corpus callosum. The rostrum forms the floor of the anterior horn of lateral ventricle and its fiber extend inferiorly to connect the orbital surfaces of the two frontal lobes. Next is the trunk, central part. The trunk is main part of the corpus callosum between its thick anterior and posterior extremities, anterior genu and posterior splenium extremities. Its fibers connect most of frontal and anterior part of the parietal lobes of the two cerebral hemispheres. The central part of corpus callosum forms the roof of central part of lateral ventricle. Next part is the splenium. The splenium is the massive posterior extremity of corpus callosum, lying 6 cm in front of the occipital pole. It overhangs the thalamic, pulvinous and pineal glands, tectum of midbrain. Then arterial supply of corpus callosum is anterior cerebral artery, anterior communicating artery and posterior cerebral artery. Then next is the internal capsule. The internal capsule is a compact bundle of projection fibers between the thalamus and caudate nucleus medially and lentiform nucleus laterally. These fibers fan out rostally of form corona radiata and condense caudally to continue as the crus cerebri of the midbrain. The ascending and descending fibers of intercapsule chiefly interconnect the cerebral cortex with the brainstem and spinal cord. These fibers are mainly responsible for the sensory and motor innervation of opposite half of the body. Then parts of the internal capsules. Internal capsule is divided into following 5 parts. First one is the anterior limb. Lie between the head of caudate nucleus medially and anterior part of lentiform nucleus laterally. Second is the posterior limb. Lie between the thalamus medially and posterior part of the lentiform nucleus laterally. Third is the genu. Is the bend between the anterior and posterior limb with concavity of the bend facing laterally. Next is the retrolentiform part. Lies behind the lentiform nucleus. Next is the sublentiform part. Lies below the lentiform nucleus. Next is the constituent fibers of internal capsule. Mainly motor fibers and sensory fibers. Then motor fibers is mainly 3 types: corticopontine fibers, pyramidal fibers and extrapyramidal fibers. Sensory fibers is the thalamocortical fibers and corticothalamic fibers. First one is the corticopontine fibers. originate from the cerebral cortex of all the lobes of cerebral hemisphere and forms the largest single group of projection fibers in the internal capsule. They are named according to the lobe from which they arise. Example: frontopontine, parietopontine, occipitopontine, and temporopontine arising from frontal, that is frontopontine, parietal, parietopontine, occipital, occipitopontine, and temporal, temporal lobe, temporopontine, respectively. The frontopontine fibers are most numerous and pass through the anterior limb, genu, and posterior limb. The parietopontine and occipitopontine fibers pass through the retrolentiform part. The temporopontine fibers pass through the sublentiform part. Then next is the pyramidal fibers. These arise in the cerebral cortex and really in the lower motor neuron within the brainstem and spinal cord. Pyramidal fibers are of two types: corticonuclear fibers and corticospinal fibers. Corticonuclear fibers synapse with the contralateral motor nuclei of the cranial nerves, which innervate the head and neck muscles. Corticonuclear fibers occupy the genu of internal capsule. Corticospinal fibers synapse with the anterior horn cell of the opposite half of the spinal cord, which innervate the muscles of the upper limb, trunk and lower limb. The corticospinal fibers form several discrete bundles in the anterior two-thirds of posterior limb. Next is the extrapyramidal fibers. These arise in the cerebral cortex and relay into the subcortical gray matter belonging to the extrapyramidal system, that is red nucleus, corpus striatum, substantia nigra, etc. They are named according to their destination, that is corticorubral, corticostriate, corticocongreal, etc. Most of extrapyramidal fibers occupy the position near the corticospinal fibers in the internal capsule and are therefore affected in the lesion of posterior limb. Next is the sensory fibers. Sensory fibers are mostly thalamocortical fibers and corticothalamic fibers, which radiate from thalamocortical fibers which radiate from thalamus in different directions to reach the widespread area of cerebral cortex and constitute most of thalamic radiation. Most of thalamocortical fibers are tertiary sensory neuron of various sensory pathways conveying some sensation to the cerebral cortex. The other fibers contributing the formation of thalamic radiation are corticothalamic fibers. According to the direction of these fibers, the thalamic radiation is divided into following subgroups: inferior thalamic radiation, superior thalamic radiation, posterior thalamic radiation, and inferior thalamic radiation. Then next is the lateral ventricle. Blood supply of before lateral ventricle. uh, One point is adding in the internal capsules, arterial blood supply is medial and lateral striate branches of middle cerebral artery, striate branches of anterior cerebral artery, and central branches of anterior coracoidal artery, and some direction branches from the internal carotid artery. Then central branches of posterior communicating artery and posterolateral central branches of posterior cerebral artery. These are the arterial supply, blood supply of the internal capsule. Then next is the lateral ventricle. There are two lateral ventricles, one in each cerebral hemisphere. Each lateral ventricle is a roughly C-shaped cavity situated within each cerebral hemisphere. The lateral ventricle wraps itself around the thalamus, the lentiform nucleus, and the caudate nucleus. It is lined with epiderma and filled with cerebrospinal fluid. It has a cavity of about 7 to 10 ml. The main parts of two ventricles are separated from each other by septum extending between corpus callosum and fornix, called septum pellucidum. The septum pellucidum is a thin vertical sheet of neurons tissue consisting of gray and white matter and covered on either side by epiderma. Each lateral ventricle communicates with the third ventricle through the interventricular foramen. Most of the central cerebrospinal fluid in the central nervous system is produced by the choroid plexus of two lateral ventricles. Then parts of lateral ventricle. For descriptive purposes, each lateral ventricle is divided into four parts. First one is the central part or body. It lies mostly within the parietal lobe and extends from interventricular foramen in front to the splenium of corpus callosum behind. Then next part is the anterior horn. Is the anterior extension from the central part into the frontal lobe and lies in front of interventricular foramen and behind the posterior surface of the genu of corpus callosum. Next part is the posterior horn. Is the backward extension from the central part into the occipital lobe towards occipital pole. Fourth part is the inferior horn. Is considered as the direction communication of the main ventricular cavity into the temporal lobe. The inferior horn is the largest of the three horns. It begins where the central part and posterior horn meet and curves round the pulvina of thalamus into the temporal lobe to end about 2.5 centimeter behind the temporal lobe. Then boundaries of the different parts of lateral ventricle. First is the central part or body. Central part or body is triangular in shape in coronal section with medial wall, roof and floor. The roof is formed by the under surface of body or trunk of the corpus callosum. The floor slopes downward from lateral to the medial side and is formed in that order. Body of caudate nucleus, striata terminalis, thalamo-striate vein, lateral part of the upper surface of the thalamus, choroid plexus covering medial part of the upper surface of the thalamus, and upper surface of body of fornix. The medial wall is formed by the septum pellucidum. Next is the anterior horn. The anterior horn is roughly triangular in coronal section. The present roof, floor, anterior, medial and lateral walls. Roof is formed by the under surface of anterior part of the body of corpus callosum. The narrow floor is formed by the upper surface of the rostrum of corpus callosum. The anterior wall is formed by the genu of the corpus callosum. The medial wall is formed by the septum pellucidum. The lateral wall is formed by the bulging head of the caudate nucleus. Next part is the posterior horn. Posterior horn is quadrangular or diamond shaped in coronal section and present roof, lateral wall, floor and medial wall. The roof, lateral wall and floor are formed by a sheath of fibers from the splenium of the corpus callosum. The posteriorly sweeping fibers of the optic radiation remain separated from the cavity of posterior horn by the tapectum. Next is the inferior horn. The inferior horn is the largest and longest of the three horns. It begins where the central part and posterior horn meet. From here, it curves ventrally downward and forward into the temporal lobe. The lateral part of the roof is formed by tapetum of corpus callosum and the medial part by the tail of caudate nucleus and stria terminalis. The floor present following features from the lateral to medial side: collateral eminence, hippocampus and choroid plexus. That's all about the white matter and white matter of cerebrum and lateral ventricle. Then corpus callosum and internal capsules also we have discussed in detail. Next sessions we will discussing the cranial nerves. Please subscribe the channel, like the video and share it. Thank you for watching our channel.